It didn't fall because America invaded. It didn't fall because people suddenly stopped believing in communism. It fell because the money stopped coming in, and when the money stopped, everything else followed. For decades, the Soviet Union looked unbreakable. Military parades thundered through Moscow. Missiles stood tall in Red Square. Red flags flew across Eastern Europe to the outside world. It looked like a machine built to last forever, but power on the surface can hide weakness. Underneath, behind the propaganda and the speeches, the Soviet economy was already sick. Not temporarily weak, structurally broken. It was built on central planning, state control, and rigid bureaucracy. Factories didn't produce what people wanted. They produced what planners ordered. Efficiency didn't matter. Quality didn't matter. Innovation didn't matter. What mattered was obedience. In capitalist systems, bad businesses fail. In the Soviet system, bad businesses were kept alive indefinitely. This created massive waste, low productivity, and outdated technology. By the 1970s, the gap between the Soviet Union and the West was obvious. American households were filling with consumer goods, electronics, and modern appliances. Soviet shelves were often empty. Even food became a problem. The Soviet Union, despite its size, struggled to feed its own people. Grain shortages became common. To survive, the USSR had to import food from the very capitalist nations it claimed to oppose. So how did such a weak system survive for so long? The answer was oil. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Soviet Union discovered massive oil and gas reserves in Siberia. This discovery changed everything. Oil exports brought in hard currency, especially US dollars. Those dollars were used to buy food, machinery, and technology from the West. Oil money didn't fix the Soviet economy, it hid its failures. As long as oil prices stayed high, the system looked stable. The leadership avoided reforms. Instead of modernizing, they increased military spending. They expanded global influence. They subsidized failing industries. Oil revenue became a financial painkiller, numbing the symptoms without curing the disease. By the late 1970s, oil and gas made up more than half of Soviet export earnings. The entire empire was quietly becoming dependent on a single commodity it didn't control. This was the most dangerous mistake the Soviet leadership ever made. They assumed oil prices would always stay high. They believed demand would never fall. They believed producers would never flood the market. They believed history was on their side. There was no backup plan, no diversified economy, no flexibility. The Soviet system couldn't adapt to shocks. It could only endure them until it couldn't anymore. American policymakers were watching closely. During the Cold War, the United States studied the Soviet system carefully, and they noticed something important. The USSR could survive military pressure. It could survive political isolation, but it could not survive prolonged economic stress. Unlike the United States, the Soviet Union couldn't print the world's reserve currency. It couldn't borrow endlessly. It couldn't innovate its way out of crisis. Oil revenue was its lifeline. Cut that lifeline, and the entire system would start to suffocate. But America alone couldn't control global oil prices. They needed a partner. That partner was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia wasn't just another oil producer. It was unique. It had massive reserves, extremely low production costs, and most importantly, the ability to rapidly increase or decrease output. It was the swing producer, the country that could move oil prices up or down, and Saudi Arabia had a long-standing alliance with the United States. Since the 1940s, the deal was simple. America would guarantee Saudi security, and Saudi Arabia would align its oil policy with American interests. By the early 1980s, this relationship would quietly reshape world history. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was becoming more confident and more reckless. High oil prices fueled expansion, military spending surged. The invasion of Afghanistan drained resources. The empire stretched itself thinner and thinner, believing oil money would always cover the cost. But the foundation was fragile. The entire Soviet economy was bouncing on one number, the price of oil. As the 1980s began, the conditions were set. The United States elected leaders determined to win the Cold War, not manage it. Saudi Arabia gained full control over its oil policy, and the Soviet Union became more dependent on oil revenue than at any point in its history. What came next wasn't a battle. There were no bombs, no tanks cross borders, just oil prices collapsing. And when they did, the illusion of Soviet power would finally shatter. What destroyed the Soviet Union wasn't chaos. It was planning. Careful, quiet, strategic planning. By the early 1980s, the Cold War had entered a new phase. The United States had learned something crucial over decades of tension, direct confrontation with. The Soviet Union was dangerous, expensive, and unpredictable. Nuclear war was unthinkable. Another world war was impossible. So the battlefield shifted, from missiles to markets, from armies to economics, from ideology to oil. When Ronald Reagan entered the White House in 1981, he didn't believe the Soviet Union could be reformed or peacefully outgrown. He believed it could be outspent, outlasted, and economically cornered. The goal wasn't negotiation. The goal was pressure, sustained, relentless pressure. Reagan's administration understood something earlier presidents had only partially grasped. The Soviet Union looked strong militarily, but financially, it was brittle. It lacked flexibility. It lacked innovation, and most importantly, it lacked control over its own economic fate. Oil revenue was the glue holding the system together. At the same time, Saudi Arabia was facing its own crisis. During the 1970s, high oil prices had made OPEC powerful, but they had also damaged global demand. Western economies slowed. Alternative energy was explored. Oil consumption growth weakened Saudi Arabia, trying to stabilize prices, had cut production repeatedly while other OPEC members cheated and overproduced. By the early 1980s, Saudi Arabia was losing market share and influence. Then the alignment happened. American officials and Saudi leadership shared a common interest. The United States wanted to weaken the Soviet Union economically. Saudi Arabia wanted to reassert dominance over the oil market and punish OPEC members who violated quotas. The solution served both. Flood the market. Saudi Arabia dramatically increased oil production. From around 2 million barrels per day, it surged to over 10 million. Tankers filled the seas. Oil flowed faster than demand could absorb it. Prices collapsed with stunning speed. From over $35 a barrel, oil plunged to below $10 for consumers in the West. It felt like relief. Gasoline became cheap. Inflation slowed. Economic growth resumed. For the Soviet Union, it was a financial disaster unfolding in slow motion. Every dollar drop in oil prices ripped billions from Soviet export earnings. Hard currency reserves evaporated. The money that paid for imported food, machinery, and technology disappeared almost overnight, and the Soviet system had no shock absorbers. In a market economy, prices fall and industries adapt. In a centrally planned system, prices fall and panic spreads upward. Ministries scrambled. Planners argued. Reports were rewritten. But no one could fix the core problem. There was no alternative revenue stream. Oil wasn't just an export. It was the backbone of the Soviet budget. It funded subsidies that kept food cheap. It paid for military spending. It supported satellite states across Eastern Europe. When oil revenue collapsed, the entire structure began to crack. At the same time, the United States intensified pressure from every direction. Military spending skyrocketed. New weapons programs forced the USSR into an arms race it could not afford. Strategic Defense Initiative announcements alone pushed Soviet defense planners into panic. Fearing technological gaps they couldn't close, the Soviet leadership was trapped. Cut military spending and risk losing global influence. Cut social spending and risk internal unrest. Borrow more money and deepen dependency on the West. Every option made the situation worse. Inside the Soviet Union, the effects became impossible to hide. Store shelves grew emptier. Lines grew longer. Factories slowed as imported components vanished. Agricultural failures became more frequent as machinery and fertilizer imports declined. Eastern Europe felt the shock too. Soviet subsidies shrank. Loyalty weakened. Governments that had depended on Moscow's support felt abandoned. Meanwhile, oil prices stayed low. Saudi Arabia held its position. Production remained high. The message was clear. The era of guaranteed oil wealth was over. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was bleeding economically. Its leaders knew the truth. Even if they couldn't admit it publicly, the system was unsustainable. The old methods no longer worked. Something had to change. That something would be reform. And reform, in a rigid system built on control, would prove even more dangerous than collapse. Because once the flow of oil money was cut, the illusion of stability vanished. By the time the Soviet leadership accepted that the crisis was real, it was already too late to stop it. The money was gone. The system was cracking, and the old rules no longer worked. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power facing the nightmare no previous leader had inherited. Oil revenues were still low. The economy was shrinking. Military spending was unsustainable. The people were exhausted. The empire was holding together through fear and habit, not strength. Gorbachev understood something his predecessors refused to admit. The Soviet Union could not survive unchanged. The economic model was broken. Central planning had failed. Oil would never again provide the safety net it once did, so he tried something radical. He opened the system. Perestroika was meant to restructure the economy. It allowed limited market activity, reduced central control, and encouraged efficiency. Glasnost allowed openness, criticism, and public discussion. Together, they were meant to save socialism by modernizing it. But reforms don't happen in a vacuum. Once people are allowed to speak, they don't stop at economics. They talk about corruption. They talk about shortages. They talk about lies. And once they talk, they start to question everything. The Soviet system had survived for decades by controlling information. Glasnost shattered that control overnight. Newspapers reported failures. Television showed reality. History was re-examined. Trust in the state evaporated. At the same time, Perestroika failed to deliver quick results. The economy existed in a dangerous middle ground, no longer fully planned, but not truly market-based either. Production fell, inflation rose, shortages worsened. People blamed the government, not the system. Oil prices never recovered enough to save the situation. Without oil money, Moscow could no longer subsidize Eastern Europe. One by one, satellite states slipped away. Poland, Hungary, East Germany. The Soviet grip weakened everywhere. When the Berlin Wall fell, the message was unmistakable. The empire was finished. Inside the Soviet Union, nationalism surged. Republics that had been held together by force now demanded independence. The Baltic states pushed back first. Others followed. Moscow no longer had the economic power or the political will to stop them. In 1991, the final blow came not from America, but from within. A failed coup attempt by hardliners exposed how fragile the state had become. Authority collapsed. Control vanished. The Soviet Union dissolved almost overnight. No war, no invasion, just bankruptcy, exhaustion, and collapse. The Cold War ended not with a treaty, but with an empty treasury. The United States emerged as the world's only superpower. The dollar reigned supreme. Oil continued to be priced in dollars, reinforcing American financial dominance. Saudi Arabia secured its position as the world's key oil producer. Its alliance with the U.S. stronger than ever, and the Soviet Union became history. The most striking lesson was this: the empire didn't fall when tanks rolled in. It fell when oil prices fell. It fell when a system built on control meant an economy it couldn't control. Power today doesn't always come from armies. It comes from supply chains, from currencies, from markets, from leverage invisible to most people. The Soviet Union learned that too late, because when money loses its flow, ideology collapses. When oil loses its price, empires lose their power. And sometimes, the deadliest weapon isn't a bomb. It's an economic decision made quietly, thousands of miles away.